Okay, thanks Monique, and thanks to NENA for having me here. It's a great opportunity to float some ideas and to get some feedback. And so I'd just like to build on what Andrew suggested earlier about how we make use of complementary currencies effectively to reward work that's not recognised by the current monetary system. And also Sam has just given us a great explainer of why we should nationalise the banking system. And I really do strongly support the need for change, and I agree with many of their ideas. However, I want to throw a pebble in the pond and maybe suggest that we could in fact nationalise our money system to address the problems that they've identified without actually nationalising the commercial banks and still leave room for complementary currencies. And the reason that I'm looking at this sort of approach is to keep those terrible people, the free marketers, on board, who are still a major part of our society. And if we want to make change, we need to find a way to encourage the best of what they offer while curtailing the worst of what they can deliver to us. And if we do this, I believe by nationalising our money supply, we can in fact eliminate many of the systemic risks and the shortcomings in our current system. Now, you might happen to think that our money supply is already nationalised, but it isn't. And I mightn't be able to convince you in the next few minutes, but I am hoping that I will set you thinking. But first of all, I want you to close your eyes. So everybody, please close your eyes and imagine you're walking down the street and the shops are full of food and you're hungry. You reach into your pocket for your phone to buy some lunch and you find out you've lost your bloody phone. Now, how would you feel? Now imagine you've got no phone, no savings and no job. What are you going to do? Just feel that for a moment as you stare through the shop windows. Okay, you can open your eyes. So most of us are lucky enough to take money for granted, yet without it, we've got absolutely no way of expressing our needs to the market. And if we're invisible to the market, then the market can never produce what we need when and where we need it. And this is not due to a lack of resources. It's simply a function of how the market works. It needs money to function. What's rarely recognised is that 50% of the population are potentially in this position, as they can't work in the paid economy. And these are our young and our old and our disabled, as well as their unpaid carers and those between jobs. So a bit over 50%. Now, many are lucky enough in these groups to have a family to fall back on or inherited wealth or something. But for about 12 to 15% of the population, they're basically on their own. And these are mostly women with young kids, as well as disabled and elderly people, all without a home of their own. Now, the thing about this is that this is not a group of takers. It's not a static group. The young grow up, the disabled and the old die, and their carers go and find paid work, as do most of those between jobs. But as they do, another cohort comes along and takes their place. So this percentage of people is fixed over time, and it can't be helped by improving the job market or growing the economy, because by definition, they're outside the economy and the jobs market. So the current answer to this problem is, of course, charity and welfare, and indeed crime, which is quite a rational response if you think about it, to exclusion. The trouble is that this approach then creates second-class citizens, the takers, and welfare traps that discourage people from taking on work that might improve their circumstances, but because the benefits don't outweigh they outweigh the net income, when the loss of benefits outweighs the net income, if you take into account the time and effort required, people often then don't bother taking small amounts of work. They stick on the welfare. So a different approach, and Sam raised it earlier, is to provide a universal basic income set at least at the poverty line, so no one is ever in the situation where they can't afford to buy food or put a roof over their head. And I'll come back to this shortly as we explain a new way to structure the bank system. But first, I want you to imagine you have some money, and the question is, how do you know what it's worth? And of course, people say, well, a dollar's worth a dollar. But what we're really asking is, given the time and the effort taken to earn the money and your current needs, what good or service is worth handing it over for? So unfortunately, many people think of money as having value itself, but you can't eat it. And for the most part, nowadays, you can't even burn it for heat. So in itself, money is worthless. Our real wealth are our natural, human, our technological, organisational and knowledge resources that together provide our collective productive capacity. Money is simply a measure, not anything else. When you hand it over, all that you are giving a seller is a record in standard units of the real value that they have provided to you. Now, this record is extremely valuable, even though in itself it's worthless, because it allows the seller to recover the same amount of value from another vendor in the community in the form of real goods and services as they spend the money. And of course, once the money is spent, the original seller will have got back the same amount of value that they put in when they first sold their own goods and services. So things stay in balance. What you put in is what you get out. Now, it shouldn't matter how long a person waits to spend their money. They should be able to get the same real value back out, even if it takes them 10 years to spend it. But for this to happen, we need to minimise both deflation and inflation. And we also need to adjust savings in line with inflation, because otherwise a person is going to be left having put value in, holding on to their record, sticking it in a bank account, and then finding in 10 years' time, they don't get back what they had put in the first place. So it's obvious in terms of setting this value that each person has to make their own judgment as to the amount of pay they're prepared to take for the work they do and the price that they're prepared to pay for any goods and services given their own circumstances. And it works, as I said, on the premise that you get to take out what you put in. It also assumes that the value is always fairly assigned. And as unfortunately, as we all know, many of the systems that we use to measure a person's contribution are subject to fraud, abuse of power, unequal knowledge, and these system problems result in some people gaining more and others less than they deserve. The thing is, these problems are not the fault of money. Just looking at the role of government in this system, it's fairly straightforward. We want to ensure as far as possible that the impediments to market competition are removed so that there are many buyers and sellers in the market, that everyone ideally has equal knowledge and power in the bargaining process, that fraud and anti-competitive behaviour are punished, and last but by no means least, that a fair price is put on the use of the commons or regulations are enacted to protect it. So they're all things that we know governments ought to do and are doing, but they're in many cases doing it imperfectly. But with all those caveats, money does provide us with a wonderful way to keep a record of value created and value consumed by each person, business and government entity. But as the economy grows, we need more money to facilitate the increasing total of transactions. The question is, where does this additional money come from? Now, most of you know, and Sam and Andrew alluded to it, basically all money is created through the banking system. And it happens, as surprising as it is to some, that new money is created when banks advance loans. So no bank ever comes along and asks, can I borrow your deposit to lend it on? They actually create the deposits at the same time as they create the loans, basically writing the money into or out of thin air. So this money that then is borrowed gets spent into the economy, boosting demand. And of course, the reverse happens too. As the loans are repaid, the money is destroyed. Now, there's nothing wrong with borrowing as such. It allows us to build assets that can be enjoyed while we work to pay them off. And especially in the case of infrastructure, if a government borrows to pay it off over the life of the asset, then future taxpayers contribute to its cost just as they share in the benefits. So that there is some valid reason for asking the government to borrow for its infrastructure. Nevertheless, lending needs to be done wisely. And the reason is, as we would recognise, that it provides the borrower with new purchasing power that they haven't earned. The expectation is that the borrower will then work and invest to create value, and in the process, they will earn money out of which the loan can be repaid. So once again, like the seller, once the buyers and the sellers, once the loan's been repaid, the borrower and society are square. The borrower will have had to put back in through work and investment the same amount of value that they first took out when they spent the proceeds of the loan. Now, all that is well and good, but of course, the downside of creating all money as debt is that to finance a growing economy, your net debt has to continually rise. This places an ever-increasing burden on state and local governments, businesses and individuals as they're forced to borrow more and more. It means that if any sector is not borrowing, other sectors must step into the breach. So, for example, if a business isn't borrowing, or if businesses in general are not borrowing, either a government and or individuals must to keep the economy afloat. And there's also the problems of deflation and inflation. If too little money is borrowed, it leads to reduced demand and potentially deflation. And if too much, it can drive demand beyond the capacity of the economy to respond, leading obviously to inflation. Now, getting the balance right at the moment is left to central banks, who have some very, very blunt tools, basically the cash rate and more recently quantitative easing, which is printing money essentially. And in the case of quantitative easing, it really has very little effect on the real economy. And by that I mean the businesses and people involved in making goods and providing services. The financial economy, which Sam alluded to, is where assets essentially are traded, including derivatives and financial instruments that are just concocted in order to provide somebody effectively with a means of gambling within the money system. So this distinction between the real economy and the financial economy is important for how money flows through the total. So once again, I want you to imagine that you're spending your money and looking at where does it go, and you can see some of it continues to circulate as wages and payments to suppliers, but if you notice, a portion of it always goes to higher executive salaries and bonuses and dividends, so that over time with each iteration, money is siphoned off from the productive economy as the executives and investors spend their earnings into the financial economy, boosting asset prices. And once the money is in the financial economy, it rarely trickles down again. And you might say money flows up much faster than it trickles down. So this system creates a number of risks. It encourages moral hazard, and that's where bank officers take all the reward as high salaries and bonuses and share options, but the community bears most of the risk of bad loans if there is widespread failure. It also means you can lose your life savings through absolutely no fault of your own, if your bank fails due to poor lending practices and or in a severe economic depression. It means that good borrowers as well lose out when their interest rates are raised, or worse, their loans are called back in to cover the losses on bad loans. It means management of inflation and unemployment via the cash rate results in gross changes in lending that are often not apt to regional and sectoral problems in the economy. It means a significant proportion of the population are excluded from direct access to the goods and services produced because they can't access the money. And it also ignores, as Andrew indicated, 50% of more of human activity takes place via in-kind contributions, care in the home, volunteering, amateur activities, etc. Yet it's only the activity in the paid economy that's formally recognised as adding value, mostly in the form of GDP, whether or not it actually adds or subtracts to well-being. So within the paid economy, we have to recognise in summary that nothing gets made or done without money. Money is paid to recognise your contribution to the supply of goods and services. It provides the means to consume what's produced. And it follows that in the absence of any sharing, collectively, everyone in the production process can consume all that they produce, leaving nothing for those outside of the process. That's, as I said before, our young, sick, disabled, old, your unpaid carers, and those between jobs. Excuse me. So people outside the process get a share of our output via family, welfare, charity and crime, which results in destitution for 12 to 15% of the population throughout time. This proposal now, which I'm finally coming to in the last few minutes, looks at how we might create and allocate money in ways that better serve our individual and collective needs so that we can maximise the value of our output while ensuring everyone has at least a minimum standard of living. So what's suggested is that we nationalise all our money so that when we lodge it into a bank account, the account is actually with the central bank in central bank money. We can keep commercial banks in the loop as agents for the central bank. So they would continue to manage the issue of the loans to their customers and run the payment system, transferring money between accounts. But all the money would be on the books of the central bank, so that in effect, each commercial bank would run a subsidiary ledger of the central bank. Now, that means that it's impossible for the commercial bank to access the money that's on deposit with the central bank to meet its debts, because those accounts are in the name of the individual who holds the deposit, not in the name of the commercial bank. So in consideration for the ability of these commercial banks to make loans and run the payment system where they earn interest and fees, then we would ask commercial banks be required to guarantee to the central bank the repayment of any loans that they may make. So they're using central bank money and they're issuing it to their borrowers as agent for the central bank. They're making money out of that in terms of interest and fees. They're providing a service, which they ought to, which is evaluating the worth of the borrower, making sure that they do repay. So it's a valuable service if they do it properly, but if they don't do it properly, then they should be liable for any losses on the loans that they make. That is, they should guarantee to the central bank the repayment of any loans. The benefits of working in this way is that it reverses the guarantee, it puts the commercial bank's equity at risk without putting depositors or good borrowers at risk. In doing so, it eliminates moral hazard, because now any executive making a decision to lend in a way that's improper means that they, as a senior executive, and the bank shareholders are the only losers. So we could allow those banks to go bankrupt, just as we allow any organisation to go bankrupt if they fail to deliver services and goods to the market at a profitable rate. It also enables the central bank to automatically credit each account with money to compensate for inflation. So every month you can have a small amount of money added to your deposit, tax-free. It simply recognises the real value of your savings. It enables the central bank also to better target regions and sectors of the economy by, instead of using the cash rate to change all interest rates, they can require borrowers to pay an extra margin on specific loans for specific purposes. So say the housing market in Melbourne is overheating. If we don't want to impact other markets, and we certainly don't want to discourage new homes being built, what we can do is have the central bank place an extra margin on loans that are made specifically to buy existing houses in Melbourne. That's going to increase the cost of borrowing for existing houses. That would damp demand overall, but leave people free to borrow to build new homes, which increases supply, which again takes pressure off demand and inflation. And importantly, it enables the central bank to then issue a universal basic income in accordance with its twin objectives of keeping inflation and unemployment low. So this money would be treated as income for tax and welfare purposes, so there'd be no need to change any of the legislation or administration. And to test the system and to eliminate concerns that lots of people have about the impact on employment and inflation of a universal income, the central bank could start small. So it could start with simply $10 a week per person. And then if the world doesn't fall apart, it could increase the amount quarterly with the aim of moving the rate to the equivalent of the poverty line over 10 years. And currently that's $500 a week. So quarter by quarter we increase it. And so long as we see that the world is not disintegrating as a result, what we ought to find is, in fact, the world is getting a lot better as people improve their health, their mental well-being, and find the ability to participate more readily in the workforce through taking on part-time or other work. Now, if inflation does start to tick in, it's still got the ability to increase rates either by areas or across the board by adding a margin, as I suggest. We could also give the central bank the power to levy a flat tax on all spending to take money out of the economy. Now, given it would have been pumping money in to keep the economy functioning, it would be pretty disingenuous to object when it takes the money out to avoid inflation. And the combination of a flat amount of money to everybody and a percentage flat rate tax on spending is actually progressive, because the amount of tax that people on higher spending pay is much greater than the people who would be paying it on a smaller income, while everybody gets the same amount of UBI. So together, the UBI and a flat percentage tax is actually progressive. So these changes, with these changes, the central bank could become the independent economic manager. It would leave the government free to focus on delivery of public goods and services to be financed by a combination of tax, borrowing, and, as Sam alluded, by direct funding from the central bank to improve our infrastructure. So these proposals basically aim to give people control over their money without the system risks that we currently face. So that's all I basically have to put on the table. I'm very happy to take questions if there are any, and appreciate, as I said, the opportunity to throw a few of these pebbles into the pond. Thank you.